should be recording. Says we're recording. Perfect. Okay, I'm now going to get onto Response Sergeants and pass over to our first speaker, which is the demand analysis team from Cleveland. So if someone from there wants to share their screen, I think that should be us good to go.
So my name's Alan Fox. I'm the senior demand analyst. If you can bear with me 2 moments, I'll share my screen and then we can go from there. Is everyone able to see that? Brilliant.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to start with a quick agenda of what we're going to run through. I'm going to go through a quick introduction, which just covers off why we did what we did, the methodology which we used, a few considerations we had, a few things that came when we actually completed the models, what some of the outputs were, and a quick summary. So just to start with, is in late 2020, Process Evolution built our response profiler model for us as part of their consultancy. That was both a baseline model and some scenario modeling around some potential reallocation and tasks and process improvements that were discussed as part of that process. While the response profiler covered our PC requirements, traditionally we basically allocated sergeants on a supervisory ratio, but especially in the climate with the volume of probationers that we have at the moment, the force really wanted to understand the demand that was placed on the response sergeants directly. So as a result, at that point, we made the decision that we were going to create a baseline demand model for the response sergeants and make sure that reflected both the current scenario and the scenario modeling that we completed as part of the response profiler. So in terms of methodology, to start with, we sort of covered off the following areas. So we started with practitioner workshops. So that allowed us to get qualitative feedback from the professional judgment on areas of hidden demand that weren't necessarily in the CAD system, would have been unavailable through the data analysis. We interrogated the force systems because that allowed us to collate and analyse some of the quantitative data around incident attendance, crime-related activities and abstractions. And we also interrogated some locally held data. So this is like that. So that allowed us to collate and analyse some quantitative data around areas, just things like handovers and phone calls. We didn't do a direct activity analysis, but the locally held data sort of tallied as an activity analysis in this instance. So once we'd done that initial assessment around all the data we'd got together, we made the decision we were going to use Workload Profiler for the response sergeants. And what that also included was creation of delivery profiles, just to allow us to understand not just when how much demand was being placed on the sergeants, but also when it was happening. What we decided not to do at that stage is due to the volumes and quantities of different types of demand, we didn't include a simulation model to deal with simultaneous demand, but that was generally because the sort of dynamic demand, as it were, was really a small subset of the overall demand. So that's why we went with Workload Profiler. So the considerations that we needed is the first thing we took is the qualitative feedback from the response sergeants. So the sergeants during those conversations generally regarded themselves as a bit of a specialist role due to the level of risk involved and also the daily need to spin plates. So in all honesty, is whenever we speak to people, quite often they do consider themselves specialists, but there was actually one sergeant who'd moved from one of our what would be considered specialist departments that actually said being a response sergeant was required more of that spinning plates than he would ever encountered in the other area that he was previously. Within our establishment also, we established that there was a high number of temporary and acting sergeants contained with the budgeted establishment, and it was actually at that stage around 54%. Due to a recent promotion board, that should change moving forward, but at the time that's what it was. And one of the major things that we identified is that depending on what shift you were on, you would have a different demand. So day shifts would be consistently dealing with the phone calls, emails and tasks, and we generally had limited capacity for any team management. When the back shifts came on, they felt like they're putting the wheels back on for the things that the day shift sergeants didn't have time to do. And then once you hit the night shift, that would have more scope for patrol, incident attendance, and supporting colleagues and team management. Additionally, the large volume of probationers were creating additional demand through the queries and guidance and other things that new starters need. There was a general feeling, though, that that was also compounded by the shifts being inexperienced. So the shifts themselves weren't in a position to provide support student officers in the same manner that an experienced officer would have been able to. Another thing was that we recently, prior to doing the demand modelling, there was a team structure change from a 5-team into a 4-team, and that increased demand around shift rollers, so things like handovers, etc. And one thing the sergeants did mention is that they were using coping mechanisms to keep up with the demand placed on them, such as working on admin tasks when on rest days from home. At this moment in time, we're at the beginning of our journey to understand our demand, but that is generally something that we've seen across a number of areas that we've gone into, and it's not unique to the response sergeants at this stage. Beyond that, another consideration we had was in relation to the management of incidents. So we considered a couple of things such as the immediate and priority incidents, because sergeants will always be aware of the incidents and they'll regularly provide guidance and assistance to responding officers. I put some timings on there and they were quite indicative so for example, even if they weren't specifically doing anything, just being the awareness of the P0 or an immediate incident would probably take them 5 minutes of their time. And we want to account for those things, even though potentially they wouldn't have any direct involvement in any of the data systems. Additionally, when CID are unavailable, sort of over the night, between 6 and 8 a.m., the sergeants have additional responsibility managing the risks of ongoing incidents. The majority of their incident-related activities we found were desk-based from the office, but there was some physical attendance when capacity allows. The physical attendance was a lot easier to capture because we could get that directly from our sort of data systems. In addition to that, the force control room also placed hidden demand on them in terms of requirement for resource. So when the FCR dispatch were unable to find a deployable resource for a job, generally the consensus is they will then contact the sergeants. Normally it'd be for a priority job, sort of after a period of time, but they'd ask the sergeants to intervene to sort of find a deployable resource so we can get somebody there. With all that considered, where you moved on to the modelling stage, the first thing we did was split the different activities in a high level. So for example, we used an admin category that was covered things like phone calls and emails. With phone calls, we actually have quite a good system where we can, for an extension, we can get all of the information for the phone calls in and out. So the phone calls was very much quantitative data. The only thing we need to be careful of was measuring that off against making sure we weren't double counting against other areas of demand. So we could actually pull the incoming phone calls there. We also looked at briefings, things like parade on, nighttime economy meetings, pay setter updates, anything to do with crime. So the initial update and the initial PIPs, their crime reviews that the sergeants would need to do, the CPS file reviews and any closure reviews. Incidents, so that's whether that was at scene attendance, incident monitoring, updates and guidance, everything associated with that. And missing from home was very much done in conjunction with the force control room, but the sergeant's responsible for tasking of high risk MISPers, risk assessments around them, unit tasking and reviewing found MISPers. We also had categories around niche. That was things like arrest requests, case builds, crime disposals, custodies, intelligence submissions and PPNs. So again, that was a good area where we could get a lot of quantitative data. Anything to do with prisoners. So we have a daily meeting with our prisoner handling team, updating CID and task allocation. We use, because of the volume of them, we actually use shift rollers as its own area. so things like handovers, anything to do with vehicle issues, arrest temps, or rolling DVs. And then the final area we used was supervision. So this was things like quality assurance, reviewing the duties, the HR admin, things like sickness and overtime, PDRs, and we had the supervision areas where we included the data around probationers. So in terms of probationers, probably one area to touch on is we understand when we were looking at it that the significant impact of probationers will likely be in the short to medium term. Natural attrition will mean there'll always be some presence, but the significant impacts up front. So we thought it was important to include that in the demand model to accurately reflect the current picture for the response sergeants, because the short to medium term is still going to be several years. And by the time we do this next time, we can consider whether it's appropriate for it to remain there. The sergeants also identified two key areas where the probationers were impacting them on a daily basis, which was providing advice and guidance, as we touched on earlier, with having quite an inexperienced shifts. They quite often fell back on the sergeants to do that, and also liaising with the work-based assessors as part of the PCDA to make sure they were up to date for any meetings that they needed to participate in. And because we couldn't get quantitative data on these type of thing, we accepted professional judgment to assign timings to the tasks. So generally the sergeant said they would probably get 5 queries per shift, and each of them would take around 10 minutes. And also that they would spend around 5 hours with the work-based assessors per probationer. So that's what we used based on the volume of probationers in the area to build up a bit of a profile on the exact impact they were having on the sergeants. Another area that came to light when we looked at things was how demand varied in the local policing areas. So the activities for response sergeants remained consistent across the LPAs, but the frequency and distribution varied from LPA to LPA. So instead of looking at response sergeants as a whole, we actually looked at response sergeants in each LPA. So when we were inputting data into the workload profiler, we had four different profiles for each of our LPAs to assign people to, rather than a single pot. And that helped us also model the outputs to quantify variations between the LPAs and the associated resource and implications. So this screen is, anyone who's touched a workload profiler will be a little bit familiar with, this is the breakdown of demand hours by activity across each of the LPAs. So we've got our 4 LPAs, and just straight away there you can see that the demand hours vary per LPA, in terms of with Hartlepool having the least 14,500 all the way through, or Middlesbrough LPA that's got 24,500. Is using these numbers, what we also did take a look at is the next slide. This is the variation in distribution. So looking at this, what we can see is that whereas Middlesbrough will spend more time on incident related and crime related activities as a sergeant, the Hartlepool sergeants would then spend more time around the shift roller activities and the supervision related activities, just due to the makeup to the shifts and the incidents in their area. So that was one thing that was important for us to establish. What we then did is, as I mentioned earlier, we did everything as a demand profile. So the graph there is basically showing the demand per hour for response sergeants, and you'll see that it tallies exactly with the qualitative feedback we received, is that the demand is highest early in the morning, which is where they have little capacity to do other things. It remains consistent throughout the day, so when the back shift comes in, they're able to support with that, and then the demand's lesser overnight, which is when they then get their opportunities for the patrol and supporting their team in a more constructive way. In terms of the outputs, what the demand did allow us to establish is that based on the establishment at the time, the response sergeants were over 100% utilisation in the LPA. The average actually across them was 116% on average across the whole establishment, which suggests that the supervisory ratios may be off. What the reason it was important for us to also establish the coping mechanisms in the first place is that actually justifies that could be a realistic figure. Is if there were no coping mechanisms in place, then no one would be able to work over 100% utilization. Beyond that, the baseline model also identified the resourcing required for each of the LPAs to meet their associated demand. But ultimately, additional resourcing wasn't the only potential solution to the over-utilization of the response sergeants. So this is what led us on to creating the scenario modeling in line with the previous work process Evolution had done around the response profiler. So when we did the scenario modeling, what we calculated is if all the proposed changes were implemented, they would see a reduction in their utilization from 116% down to 108% on average. However, they'd still be over 100% utilized. Beyond that, what we did establish is that in order to actually meet an 85% utilization under the current establishment, a further 60,000 hours would need to be removed from the response sergeants. And we also completed some additional work to provide the command with what the required resourcing would be at different utilization levels. And that was both across both the baseline and the scenario model so that they had full evidence for any decisions they were making. In terms of that, once we completed that, we reported all of our findings from both the baseline and the scenario modeling into the senior management team, and they were included within our force management statement. In terms of decisions, no decisions have been made yet because the force management statement is under construction as we speak. So once that's been completed, we'll probably have a better idea of what the outcome of our work was. And just finally, as a bit of a summary, our key learnings were the roles of response sergeants, not a one size fits all, and the demand makeup can vary depending on the area. Not all the response sergeant activities have good quality data sets, so professional judgment from the practitioners is important to ensure hidden demand is adequately captured. Alternatively, we could use activity analysis. I know one of the force mentioned doing that, where there's capacity to do so. Due to the uplift programme, consideration needs to be given to the inclusion of additional probationer workload, as while it should reduce in the long term, it is significant in the short term. And just finally, we've seen that often demand work in other areas will have knock-on impacts to the response sergeant model, such as additional meetings and crime allocation. For example, when we're doing another demand project, something they wanted to do as part of their scenarios was have a regular meeting with response sergeants. So we need to consider that when we go back, is because if that is implemented, the demand on them would increase. And that is everything from us. Is there any questions?
There's some hands up.
That looks, oh yeah.
Ricardo's got his hand up there. Ricardo, do you want to jump in with a question?
Yes, hello. Yes, I do have a question. How is it possible that the utilization was over 100%? Were the police working overtime?
Yeah, so we didn't, when we factored in the model, we factored in the abstractions that we knew people would be having. So for example, we know everyone's going to have annual leave. We know there's going to be an average sickness percentage. But what we didn't put overtime percentage in. So we didn't say that they're specifically going to work this amount of hours overtime. So the 116% and the 108% were entirely based on base hours. I think ultimately what we're saying is if they're definitely going to work overtime, that'll contribute to it somewhat. But if we don't want people to be overstretched, then we wanted baseline numbers to say this is what you would need, so there wouldn't be an absolute necessity to do these things.
Did you put in lunch breaks, Alan?
Yeah, so yeah, lunch breaks, everything, all standard abstractions, PST, first aid training, additional training, everything like that was all factored in. It was just so we didn't put it.
They're probably eating into their lunch break, so to speak.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Alan? So I have one then in terms of the 3 shifts being different. I think that to me that was quite surprising in terms of how that's been put across. It makes perfect sense, but the fact that people were so open and explained things in that way was quite interesting around having the first shift and the second shift, the late shift being putting the wheels back on. Was that something that came out quite easily during the workshops, or was that something you had to dig for?
Graham, you okay to take that one?
Yeah, so that actually was one of the first things the response sergeants actually said to us whilst we're in the workshops. And as we did the workshops during the day in their office, their phones just never stopped ringing when me and Ben were in there doing the workshops with them. So we got to experience that firsthand, and when they started talking through all the meetings that they had to go to, and when we also looked at the data that came in terms of niche tasks, in terms of phone calls that they did, and the general queries, they all seemed to be in during the office hours of the day. So we quite quickly established that actually that was an area whereby, you know, we kind of would need to look at in a bit more detail to judge what the sergeants were telling us from the very first workshop to actually what the reality was, and they both seemed to match up quite well.
Surprised they didn't ask you to come back into the workshop on a night shift as well, which would be a pain. Brilliant. Any other questions? Brilliant. Okay, what we'll do now is we're going to move on to our second presentation of today, and this is Rhiannon from South Wales Police. So please welcome Rhiannon.
Hello. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
No, Ali, I think you stop. There we go. That's coming in. Yep.
Oh.
Yes.
Fab. Okay, hello, good afternoon. My name is Rhiannon Lester. I'm one of a small team of analysts that make up the Demand and Capability team, which is one of 3 teams that sit together and perform the demand and capability, change and project management and continuous improvement functions as part of the strategic corporate services portfolio in South Wales Police. At the beginning of 2021, the Demand and Capability team were asked to support some work that was already ongoing to review response supervisor ratios as part of the new force structure project, which saw the South Wales Police force structure shift from a 4 to 3 BCU model. A number of workshops had already been facilitated by the project management team in order to gain an understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the response sergeant, including some root cause analysis work. So we already knew that our response sergeants were very busy and we had a good overview of their responsibilities. So we were asked to model the response sergeant workload with a view of getting a clearer picture of their utilisation rates and the makeup of their workload activities using the process evolution workload profiler. So initially we were working towards a very tight time frame, but the scope of the supervisor ratios project was extended and carried forward to become a change project for the 21-22 financial year. Our response sergeant establishment is 1 sergeant per response team. During 2020, our sergeant resources tended to be over-established by 3 FTE. So we reflected that in the model abstractions. And typically PC resources would act up to cover certain sergeant functions when the sergeants were abstracted for annual leave, sickness, training. So we built an additional resource into the model to represent this. We assigned the relevant activities to the other resource for the proportion of time that the sergeants were abstracted for these reasons. So we were asked to build the model at force-wide level, and our model doesn't account for BCU level variations in processes. Because a number of workshops had already been held with the response sergeants, we weren't able to arrange additional workshops to identify the frequency and timings of workload activities, which is how we'd usually capture that information. So we linked in with a group of sergeants that had already attended one of the root cause analysis workshops. And we provided them with a list of activities that make up a typical response sergeant shift. So this listed the day-to-day workload associated with a shift, including admin, supervision and review demand. We asked them to feed back the average time that they would allocate to each activity. Some of the responses we received were in no way conservative estimates. So, for example, one sergeant suggested that they completed almost 40 hours of work during a typical 9-hour shift. But we were really lucky. We had a sergeant in the project team who had recently moved across from a response sergeant role, and we worked with her to review the responses received. She was able to give us a really good picture of the activity timings and frequencies, and she acted as our Spock, linking back in with the response sergeants to sense check the timings as we built the model. We also were able to adjust some of the timings following a joint workshop with the project officers to explore opportunities for streamlining processes. So the input from the response sergeants and our Spock informed our sergeant's typical shift work stream. In order to model sergeant attendance to incidents, we used 2019 pre-COVID dispatch data to measure the volume of calls attended by sergeants and the average time spent at incidents. We arrived at an average volume of incidents as attended per set, which we verified with the response sergeants. We modelled the time that sergeants typically spend on G1 and G2 occurrence management in separate work streams. This would include the workload associated with allocating resources and reviewing and finalising G1 and G2 occurrences. We used 2019 occurrence data to identify the volumes and the profile of demand, and the average occurrence management times were allocated by occurrence type. For example, more time allocated to sexual offences and sudden deaths in comparison with ASB occurrences. And our other activities work stream included supervisor time for PCPDRs and NPPF PLT days for newly qualified sergeants. There were some challenges in balancing the model because we knew that our response sergeants were very busy and juggling competing demands. They would pick up some work activities off shift, and we understood that potentially sergeants were not always able to dedicate as much time on certain activities as they would like. Some tasks would be parked as others were prioritised, and sergeants would usually work through lunch. We built a separate work stream to quantify the demand that sergeants were picking up off shift and used this to offset some of the demand included in the typical shift work stream. So this included a 20-minute handover with the previous shift sergeant before the start of their shift, and an average of around an hour and a half per set completing admin tasks at home. The project team had already conducted a response supervisor survey, and that gave us an indication of how much work sergeants were picking up outside of office hours. So by measuring this and considering the impact of adding lunch as an abstraction and how response sergeants would prioritise their workload, the baseline model we arrived at gave a representation of the workload that sergeants are expected to pick up. And our sergeant colleague in the project team played a critical role in helping us to reach a comfortable and fair baseline model. Based on the demand included in the baseline model, the response sergeant resource utilisation rate came back at 135%, with an additional 38.2 FTE resources required to meet the demand levels at a 100% utilisation rate. We projected the resource level required in order to reduce response sergeant utilisation rate to between 80 and 90% utilisation, based on the demand included in the baseline model. The workload profiler allowed us to measure the response sergeant workload by activity type, which showed us that occurrence management makes up over a third of their workload, supervision makes up 21%. Feedback from the sergeants completing the response supervisor survey indicated that they felt that admin tasks make up about 60% of their working time. But we know there's going to be some crossover there between the categories. So, for example, there'll be an element of admin activity associated with both occurrence management and supervision tasks. And looking at that makeup of their workload, we could see that 60-40 split was reflected in the outputs of the workload profiler model. And we were also able to provide a breakdown to the project management team of the time allocated annually per activity. So this highlighted where process improvements could have the maximum impact and help to focus discussions at workshops. We were able to adjust the model to measure the impact of decreasing demand or time allocated to certain activities, but the principal scenario we modelled was the introduction of a new office-based sergeant resource type, which we called the inside sergeant. Following the merge of two sectors as part of the new force structure project, this model was at the time being piloted in one sector. So in order to model this, 2 additional inside sergeants were assigned per sector, working a 4-shift pattern. and the inside sergeant role would alleviate some of the supervision, review and admin workload currently assigned to the response sergeant. And we also increased the time allocated to some activities for both resources. So, for example, more time allocated to outside sergeants for incident attendance, and an increase in the time allocated for pre and post charge file review to the inside sergeant resources. This model put the utilisation rates for the outside sergeant resources at 100% and the inside sergeant resources at 91%. And we were able again to report on the makeup of the workload assigned to each of the sergeant resources by activity type. So in the inside and outside sergeant model, occurrence management made up 41% of the outside sergeant's workload, while incident attendance had increased from 8% to 16%, and 61% of the inside sergeant's workload was made up of supervision and review activities. Following completion of our piece of work, we handed over our findings to the project team, and they progressed this work further as part of the change project. The recommendations of the role of the sergeant project were heard and accepted at Silvercog last month, with a successful bid for 30 additional patrol support sergeants to be invested into the response model as part of the neighbourhood realignment work. The feedback from the Chief Inspector on the project was very positive, and they have said that the 135% sergeant utilisation rate was a standout message and quoted in every conversation. Without our assistance and work, it may have been a different picture. And the intention is to refresh this piece of work 12 months after the posts have been put in place in order to measure the impact of the additional resources on the sergeant utilisation rate as one of the key performance indicators. So, any questions?
Somebody's got a question, surely. Have you factored in the inside and outside the requirement for vitamin C if we've got people who just are only allowed to stay inside?
What's that, sorry?
Don't worry.
It looks like you've got some fairly similar issues that that Cleveland had. You've got people working through lunch, you've got people not being able to do the full training. So in both cases, there's some similar messages coming out there, which is encouraging or interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
But at least that you were able to build up an evidence-based case to get more sergeants, which is important. Well done.
Any further questions? Ricardo?
Yes, do we have another presentation going, or is this the last one?
We've got a chat at the end about the use of the tools.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just share again. Thank you, Rhiannon, for that. It's been really useful. So what I've tried to do is just summarise the two projects. And I think, as Rob just pointed out, there are quite a lot of similarities in the two, both seeing utilisation rates for sergeants much higher than you possibly would want to see them. So typically we'd expect 80 to 95%, and in both cases seeing utilisation over 100% and having to take work home, missing lunch, and then possibly cutting corners on certain things that you'd want to do. So I think it's quite interesting to see similar themes coming throughout. And I suppose that's possibly useful for those of you who are going to be doing these types of projects going forwards, to understand not only the different ways in which the teams in Cleveland and South Wales have gone about doing this, but also the things to look out for as you go through there.